And he says the knowledge of this exchange, it is essentially the knowledge of the heart's conditions, like fear, reverential fear, like hope in Allah, like pleasure, to be pleased with the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like truthfulness and sincerity and the various other actions that take place in the heart. And this is the type of knowledge that has raised the scholars in status. It is by putting into practice this type of knowledge, by actualizing these things in a very real way, that these scholars, they have become famous. The famous ones, that is. You have scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa. You have like Imam Malik. You have the likes of Imam al-Shafi'i. And then, of course, you have Imam Ahmad, rahimahullah ta'ala. And these great imams, and there are many others, but these great imams that are continuously mentioned, he says that it's because of their pursuit of true knowledge here, not just information and facts and being the one that can just produce all of that when asked, but acting upon that knowledge is what has raised them in status, and what has decreased the status of those who were mentioned, if you will, in the realm or in the subjects of fiqh and various other Islamic sciences, is because they did not achieve that level of piety and practice and true application of knowledge. But they became distracted, if you will, and busy dealing with the theoretical topics and things that were not actually being applied by them personally. So they were unable to achieve a real, genuine practice of what they were dedicating themselves to. He says, so you will find that some of the jurists of Islam, they busy themselves talking about dhihar or al-li'an, and those are two issues that occur in marriage. Dhihar is basically when you divorce your wife by saying, you are now like the back of my mother. These are some issues, or as-sabq, which is betting, or rami, marksmanship, those types of issues that are addressed in the books of fiqh. And these scholars would essentially dive into the depths of the topic and dissect the topic in a manner that there was really no end to it. It's kind of like taking an issue and just looking at it in so many different ways when it's a debated issue and there's various different opinions. And it's kind of like spending all your time in those issues which they themselves and most people are not really in need of. How often have you heard of li'an, the oath of condemnation, or dhihar? Many scholars today that deal with their communities, and many imams, they may go their entire career and not actually have a case of dhihar. It may happen once in a lifetime or twice, or you can count it on your hand. But so some of the scholars, they got overly busy with these issues. And they wouldn't talk about ikhlas. They wouldn't talk about sincerity. They wouldn't warn people from riyah or showing off. And these things are considered individual obligations. Every person needs to know about ikhlas. Every person should be warned from showing off and riyah. And by neglecting them, it leads to destruction. If a person is not sincere in their actions, they're lost. If they become overwhelmed with their desires to be famous and have status and show off, then they're destroyed. So the first pursuit of knowledge of those detailed issues in the manuals of the fiqh manuals, those are considered fardu kifaya, communal obligation. Someone has to do it. Whereas the issues of ikhlas and sincerity and such, those are obligations that everyone needs to know. And so he said that if you ask them, why are we not having a discussion about ikhlas? Why are we not talking about riya? They won't be able to answer. They can't respond. If you ask them, why are you talking about these things? And they'll say, well, they're communal obligations. They're communal obligations. I mean, somebody's got to do it, so I'm doing it. And here, he says that by saying that, he's certainly right. That type of person is certainly right. Those are communal obligations. But guess what else is a communal obligation? Mathematics. Math is a communal obligation. Someone needs to study math. They need to learn math. They need to teach math. So why don't you busy yourself with math instead of the other issues that you become busy with? And the examples that he gives about li'an and lihar and those types of things, they're examples that perhaps were prevalent during his time. During our time, the religious leadership, there are among the ranks of the leaders of communities that get bogged down and overly invested in issues that aren't practical for the greater community. And they aren't helpful for the development of the community. They get overly invested in certain issues that deal greatly with nuance and have a lot to do with individuals, perhaps, than talking about the greater benefit of the whole. And they will say, someone has to do it. Someone has to address these topics. And they're right. But there are other topics that could also be addressed that are of similar nature and scope. But Imam ibn Qudamah, he says, the reality here is that the soul has become all pumped up and primped and seeking something. And the intention of it, to discuss these nuanced issues where there's a lot of debate, it's surrounded by controversy, is to show off and to gain status. Because status and showing off is achieved through controversy and debate, not through mathematics. Not through talking about very practical, everyday essentials. Those aren't controversial, so they don't gain a great deal of following and excitement. So this is something that is very, very important to understand about knowledge, and that is the aim and objective of seeking knowledge is so that it has a very real impact on a person's heart and a very applicable approach so that it's actually beneficial and not a tool used to someone's benefit, whether it's for status or whether it's for fame or whether it's to appear in a certain light, that I know the nuances of these issues and you don't, so I'm superior and you're not, or whatever that may be. And we'll continue with this here briefly, kind of giving some more examples as Imam al-Qudami, he says that there are a number of phrases that over time they've been changed. The phrases, the meanings of them have been changed, and they've been changed in a way which is different from the original intended meaning of the pious predecessors. And one of those examples he gives is fiqh. Many of us understand fiqh to be the law or the legal rulings of Islam. And what's happened is that the word fiqh, the meaning of it has been changed to a very specific meaning. And that is the understanding of the secondary issues of Islam. And those are the rulings, halal and haram and mubah and makruh and etc. That's the very specific meaning of fiqh. He says, however, fiqh in the original, I guess we can say in the golden age or the first days of knowledge and the first days of the scholars of Islam, what it meant was knowledge of the path to paradise. That was fiqh. Knowledge of the path to paradise. So basically that included understanding the details of the heart and its diseases, that which spoils righteous action, having a strong comprehension of the reality of this world, that the world is very lowly, that this dunya, it's cursed, it's mal'una, and having a very strong anticipation for the blessings of the hereafter. Whereas, you're constantly looking forward to the next life. You're excited about the next life. And also where your heart has become overwhelmed with reverential fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the great Imams, Al-Hasan al-Basri, Hasan ibn Yasar, he was one of the tabi'een from Basra. He said that fiqh is az-zahid fi dunya. That fiqh, the faqih, is az-zahid fi dunya, someone that abstains from the world. They're not overwhelmed with the worldly delights. Al-raghibu fil akhirah, a person who is desirous of the next life. Al-basiru bidini, he's very insightful when it comes to his faith. Al-mudawimu ala ibadati rabbi, he's consistent and constant in the worship of his Lord. He's scrupulous. Al-kaf an arad al-muslimin, he refrains from trampling on the honor of the Muslims, and who is far away from their money and their wealth. He's not after the riches of the Muslim community, and he's also very sincere when it comes to his treatment of his community. So it was that the word fiqh had to do with the knowledge of the hereafter and much more. And that was because that knowledge was not intended to be used to give fatwa, to give religious edicts and rulings. It was used to traverse the path to paradise. And now it has been warped from that general meaning, which is all-encompassing of the religion, to being a very, very specific meaning. And he says this is a type of deception when it comes to that term and what's intended. مَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ. Whoever Allah wants good for, he gives him fiqh of the religion. And if you remember in the previous section, we talked about what a number of scholars said about the meaning of fiqh. There were those that said it's jurisprudence, there were those that said it's knowledge of Quran, those that said knowledge of hadith, those that said knowledge of kalam, theological rhetoric, etc. Whereas here, he's kind of insinuating that, no, it's actually a very, very broad subject which has to do with the path to paradise and what's needed to traverse that path. Another word he says is al-ilm, which is knowledge. And what that was used for previously is knowledge of Allah and his various signs. Knowledge of Allah and his signs, knowledge of Allah's blessing, knowledge of Allah's actions and what he does for the servants. What it typically refers to is debate and argument. A person's knowledgeable if they can carry their own weight in an argument and be able to flex some muscles with their logic. Right? Another one he says is tawheed. Tawheed was something that was used to indicate that a person was able to see everything from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything comes from Allah. Everything originates from Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? They can see the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the world around them. That everything is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what that would do is it would divert them from becoming obsessed with the means and the mediums. They would no longer be obsessed with the medium of things, the medium of results, but they would see directly that the results of these things are from Allah. They wouldn't be going, the result is because, well, the water evaporated and then there was condensation and then the heat, and then they wouldn't get into the overly obsessed with the medium and the means of the world around them, but they would have this level of faith which led them to seeing Allah's actions and Allah's provisions in the world. And the fruits of this were a strong sense of trust. That this type of faith, it yields trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're no longer overly obsessed with, the worldly aspects but you become totally dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you become pleased with His decree. As for Tawheed today, especially during that time, if you will, and continues until today, what it refers to is, talking about theology, talking about doctrine, coming up with all of these different expressions and how to talk about and how to convey the knowledge of theology. And, that type of rhetoric was considered disliked among the pious predecessors. Another one is tadhkir and dhikr, reminders and remembrance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ ذِكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, and remind, for indeed the reminder benefits the believers. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said in a hadith, إِذَا مَرَرْتُمْ بِرِيَاضِ الْجَنَّةِ فَارْتَعُوا, that if you pass by the gardens of paradise, then you should stay. You should sit. You should basically enjoy. And they said, what are the gardens of paradise? And he said, majalis al-dhikr, the circles of remembrance. And so what we know of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether that is remembrance by making dhikr, subhanallah, alhamdulillah, wallahu akbar, or remembrance by way of speaking in gatherings of knowledge, what happened was it was turned into story time, where people would gather to listen to stories. And this is what they used to call dhikr and tadhkir. And there would be all types of stories, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them true, some of them not. Some of them were very, very emotionally appealing. Some of them had love stories and stories that were very difficult, much like what we have today of entertainment in the movies and in plays and in shows, where people would occupy their time with that, and they called it a dhikr wa tadhkir. And many of the stories that they were narrated during that time, they were not true. They were not true accounts of accurate accounts of what was being told. And then lastly, he says al-hikmah, which is typically referred to as wisdom. During that time, it was hikmah referred to medicine and astrology, right? Using the stars for telling the future and stuff. But the hikmah, actually, what it means is wisdom, literally, but it does not occur in a person until they combine between both knowledge and action. And that is hikmah, or a person who is hakim.